The sun burned like an invisible blade, slicing through the arid horizon of the Middle East. Soldier Ethan Miller, 27 years old with tired eyes, felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he moved through the abandoned village. Every step echoed in the absolute silence, a silence that unsettled him more than gunfire or explosions ever could. He clutched his weapon tightly against his chest, glancing from side to side, bracing for the unexpected. But what he discovered that day wasn't in any military manual. It was a nearly imperceptible sound, a faint, drawn-out whimper that made him stop. His comrades continued ahead, murmuring orders as they moved forward, but Ethan couldn't ignore it. He looked around, his brow furrowing. The whimper came again, weak and sorrowful, like the cry of someone on the verge of giving up. His eyes scanned the farthest corner until he saw it. A small brown dog lying on the dusty, blood-stained ground by a crumbling wall. Its body was still, its breathing shallow, and its eyes. Those eyes seemed to plead silently without words. Ethan felt his chest tighten. For a moment, the battlefield disappeared. There was only this small, fragile creature, so wounded and alone, mirroring the loneliness Ethan often felt himself. Slowly, he knelt down, ignoring the weight of his gear and the distant voices of his comrades fading away. "Hey, hey, it's okay, buddy," he whispered, as if speaking to someone on the brink of falling apart. The dog tried to lift its head, but its body wouldn't cooperate. One of its paws was covered in dried blood, and its ribs protruded beneath its thin coat. "Miller, what are you doing? Let's go," someone shouted from up ahead. Ethan heard but didn't respond. He took off his gloves, leaving his hands bare to avoid scaring him any further. He grabbed the water bottle strapped to his backpack and poured a few drops into his hand. The small dog, even in his weakened state, stretched his neck as far as he could to lick the precious gift as if it were the last thing he'd ever do. "That's it. Easy now. I'm here," Ethan whispered. For a moment, Ethan didn't just see a dog. He saw himself, lost in a war that seemed endless. He didn't know who was saving whom, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let this animal die here. Ignoring the voices in the distance, he tore a piece of his uniform, ripping the fabric to improvise a bandage for the injured paw. "You're coming with me. I'm not leaving you behind," he murmured, almost like a promise. As he lifted the dog into his arms, the little pup let out a faint sound, a sigh, as if he understood. What Ethan didn't know was that this decision would change the course of both their lives forever. The heat inside the military base was almost unbearable, even with the sun already low on the horizon. Ethan carried the dog in his arms, ignoring the curious stares and jokes from his comrades as they passed by. The little dog looked like a harmless brown shadow against the dusty gray uniform of the soldier. Its eyes barely opened, but its chest rose and fell slowly, as if it were fighting to keep breathing. Ethan felt that at any moment, that fragile thread of life could break, tightening his chest in a way he couldn't explain. "Miller, what the hell is that?" barked Sergeant Rhodes, appearing out of nowhere. His deep voice cut through the air like a whip. Ethan stopped in his tracks, adjusting the dog's weight in his arms. The sergeant's gaze was filled with pure disdain, as if the mere presence of the animal was an insult to the base's order. "I found him outside, sir. He's hurt. Just needed a bit of help," Ethan replied, keeping his voice low but steady. Rhodes took a step closer, inspecting the dog, which now trembled, too weak to even react. "This is a military base, soldier, not an animal shelter. Have you forgotten why you're here?" Those words hit Ethan like a punch. He gritted his teeth, feeling anger rise in his throat. Yes, he knew exactly why he was there, to fight in a war that seemed endless. But why did that mean ignoring a life so small, so defenseless? Ethan lowered his gaze to the dog, his hands feeling the faint breaths beneath the filthy, injured fur. He couldn't abandon it. "He won't bother anyone, sir. I'll take full responsibility. I need to take care of him," Ethan replied as calmly as he could. Sergeant Rhodes remained silent for a moment, his expression as hard as stone. Finally, he huffed, shaking his head. You have until dawn, Miller. If that animal causes any trouble, he's out. Understood. Understood, sir, Ethan replied, feeling a brief sense of relief. That night, Ethan improvised a small space inside his tent. He grabbed an old blanket, a makeshift water dish, and the little bit of food he could spare from his rations. Buddy, a name Ethan murmured without thinking as he settled him in, curled up on the fabric, with an empty, wary look in his eyes, though he wasn't trembling as much. Ethan sat next to him, watching the small animal's breath and feeling a strange wave of responsibility. For the first time in a long while, the soldier realized that he, too, was surviving in pieces just like that dog. "We'll be okay, buddy," Ethan whispered, leaning his back against the tent's canvas. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the cold night wind hitting the thin structure. In the dark, the faint sound of Buddy sighing reached his ears, like a quiet response, full of trust. Ethan didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving Buddy behind. For some reason, saving that little mutt seemed to be the only right thing amidst all that chaos. The next morning came too soon, bringing with it the muffled sound of boots marching and orders shouted in the distance. Inside the tent, Ethan opened his eyes and found Buddy curled up in the blanket, breathing more steadily. For a moment he smiled, a brief, almost imperceptible smile, but something in the scene made him uneasy. The little dog was still fragile, his injured paw still bandaged, but his gaze was no longer the same as the night before. Now there was something there, a thread of hope, almost shy. Ethan crouched down and gently ran his hand over Buddy's head. The animal closed his eyes, accepting the affection. "We'll take care of you, Buddy," the soldier whispered, as if promising something far bigger than just simple care. With quick movements, he wrapped the dog in a thin blanket and placed him under the cot, worried that Sergeant Rhodes might show up at any moment. The rules were clear, and Ethan knew he was treading on thin ice. Over the next few hours, Ethan went about his duties as usual, patrolling, weapon maintenance, checking equipment. But something was different. His mind kept returning to the tent, to the small being waiting for him in silence. The world around him, the distant sounds of war, the tired faces of his comrades, seemed heavier than ever. Amidst the chaos, Buddy became a small point of light, something Ethan could protect in a reality where almost nothing was safe. However, the momentary peace didn't last long. When Ethan returned to the tent at the end of the day, a cold feeling ran down his spine. The blanket was empty. The dog was no longer there. Ethan's heart raced as he looked around, the dusty ground offering no clear clues. "Buddy," he called softly, swallowing hard. Fear gripped his chest, the fear that the little mutt had crawled out of the tent and fallen into the wrong hands. He rushed out, sweat running down his face, his chest tight. "Have you seen a small dog around here? A brown mutt?" he asked every soldier he came across. The answers were the same. "Dog? Haven't seen anything, Miller." Frustration and desperation began to grow inside him until a familiar voice called out, "Looking for this?" Ethan turned quickly and found Sergeant Rhodes standing in the shadow of one of the buildings, holding Buddy by the arms, as if he were just an object. The little dog was visibly scared, his body trembling and eyes wide open. Ethan felt a boiling anger rise within him, but he took a deep breath, holding himself back. "Let him go, sir. He hasn't done anything," Ethan said, trying to stay calm. Rhodes lifted the dog into the air, examining him with a look of disdain. "You think you can bring this thing here and ignore the rules, Miller? Dogs like this don't survive here, and neither will you if you keep defying orders." The sergeant dropped Buddy carelessly onto the ground, and the small animal let out a weak whimper as he fell. Ethan immediately crouched down, picking him up in his arms, his breath short from both anger and worry. "He's with me. He's my responsibility," Ethan replied, his voice firm but low, as if about to explode. Rhodes stared at him for a few seconds before giving a half-smirk. "You've got until the end of the week to figure this out, Miller. If not, I'll take care of it myself." Ethan returned to the tent with Buddy in his arms, feeling the weight of the world on him. The dog curled up against his chest, his eyes trusting only Ethan, as if he knew this man was his only chance. The soldier gritted his teeth, staring at the orange horizon of the late afternoon. "I won't let anything happen to you, buddy, even if it costs me everything." Night fell like a heavy veil over the base, bringing with it the biting cold of the desert. Inside the tent, Ethan watched Buddy sleep on the small makeshift blanket. The dog breathed peacefully, but sometimes a slight tremor ran through his body, as if he were dreaming of the horrors of his past life. Ethan sighed, sitting beside him, his head resting against the tent's canvas. The threat of Sergeant Rhodes hung over him like a sword ready to drop. Time was against them, and he knew he had to act quickly. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a responsibility that didn't come from orders or war. It wasn't something imposed on him. It was something he had chosen. Buddy had clung to life, even when the world seemed intent on discarding him. And somehow that mirrored what Ethan had felt since he first set foot on that barren land. He spent his days trying to survive a war that often seemed pointless, but now he had someone to protect. The following dawn, as the rest of the platoon prepared for another day of patrol, Ethan made a risky decision. He took Buddy with him, hidden under a blanket in the back of a parked military vehicle. The risk was huge, but leaving Buddy alone on the base was even greater. The dog stayed silent, as if he understood that this was a critical moment. Buddy's watchful eyes followed Ethan, and it squeezed the soldier's heart more than he'd like to admit. "You're getting yourself into trouble, Miller," murmured his friend, Soldier Jackson, when he noticed the movement. "I know," Ethan replied with a half-smile, "but I'm not leaving him alone." Jackson glanced at the blanket that shifted slightly and then at Ethan. Finally, he just shook his head, murmuring, "You're lucky you're so stubborn." The patrol was long and silent. Ethan gripped the vehicle's steering wheel, feeling Buddy quietly underneath the seat. The distant sound of explosions and muffled voices from the radio filled the air, reminding him of where he was and the danger surrounding them all. When they stopped for an inspection, Ethan got out of the vehicle, his heart racing as he heard voices approaching. Cold sweat ran down his back. If they found Buddy, there would be nothing he could do. "Miller, is something wrong?" asked a superior passing by. Ethan forced a smile, pretending to be distracted. "Nothing, sir. Everything's under control," he replied, quickly diverting his gaze. Meanwhile, Buddy remained still, as if he knew that the smallest sound could be fatal. When they finally returned to base, Ethan carefully took Buddy out of the vehicle, leading him back to the tent. As soon as he set him on the ground, the dog licked his hands, his tail wagging for the first time. It was a small gesture, but enough to make Ethan's heart tighten. That simple act of gratitude made him realize just how much the animal had changed his life in such a short time. "You have no idea, Buddy, what you're doing to me," Ethan murmured, a tired smile forming on his lips. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive, as if something was pulling him back to the surface. The world outside was still gray and brutal, but in that small tent, beside that fragile yet resilient dog, Ethan found a purpose. The morning arrived with the sky covered in heavy clouds, a rarity in the relentless desert. Ethan woke with a start, as the sounds of the base began to stir around him. He looked toward the corner of the tent and found Buddy still curled up in the blanket, but now awake, watching him with alert eyes. The little dog seemed stronger, though his body still bore the signs of hunger and the wounds he'd endured. Ethan smiled faintly, running his hand over his snout. "Did you sleep well, partner?" he murmured, more to himself. Buddy responded by licking the soldier's fingers, as if he understood what those words meant. He was just a dog, but to Ethan, Buddy's company was more real than any order he'd received in the past few months. However, the threat of Sergeant Rhodes still hung over them. Ethan knew time was running out. If he didn't find a solution, Rhodes would follow through on his word without hesitation. Every time the dog barked softly or moved more loudly, Ethan felt his heart race. "They're going to hear. They're going to take him from me." The thought was a constant weight on his mind. In the afternoon, while Ethan cleaned the weapons in the yard with the other soldiers, Jackson approached and sat down beside him with a serious look. "So, what's your plan, Miller? You can't hide it forever." Ethan stopped what he was doing, taking a deep breath. "I don't know. I'm still thinking. You better think fast, because Rhodes is keeping an eye on you. Or do you think he's going to let it slide?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the horizon, where the gray sky seemed to reflect the emptiness he felt inside. The war had taken so much from him. Friends, peace, and even the certainty that he would make it home. Now, in the middle of all that chaos, he had found a reason to keep fighting, but it was about to be ripped from his hands. Why was it so hard to save something so small, so pure? At night, as the base sank into silence, Ethan decided he couldn't wait any longer. He sat next to Buddy, who looked at him curiously, his tail gently thumping the ground. "Listen, Buddy, I promised I wouldn't let anything happen to you, and I'm going to keep that promise, no matter the cost." Ethan ran his hand over the dog's head and felt his eyes burn, a lump forming in his throat. There was something in that promise that went beyond the dog. It was a promise to himself that there was still something good left in him, something the war hadn't destroyed. The wind howled fiercely against the tent walls, bringing with it the feeling that a storm was approaching. Ethan knew that the window of time was closing. Rhodes wouldn't wait much longer. If he knew what Buddy means, if he could understand that saving this dog is the only thing keeping me whole, Ethan thought, feeling a weight on his chest. That night, Ethan barely slept. Sitting on the floor beside Buddy, he watched the small brown figure sleep peacefully, unaware of the danger looming over them. Outside, the war raged on, indifferent to the bond forming inside the tent. Time was against him, but Ethan wouldn't give up. Saving Buddy wasn't just a choice. It was a matter of survival for both of them. The promised storm arrived at dawn, bringing strong winds that swept through the base with almost symbolic force. Ethan had been standing for hours, sitting beside Buddy, the dog now restless, as if sensing something bad was coming. The tension at the base was palpable, but the weight on Ethan was even more personal. He knew that morning could seal Buddy's fate, and perhaps even his own. As he adjusted the bandage on the dog's injured paw, he heard firm footsteps approaching the tent. His body stiffened. The zipper of the entrance was yanked open, revealing Sergeant Rhodes with his stern expression. "Miller," he began, his tone cold. "I gave you enough time. Where's the dog?" Ethan stood up, instinctively positioning himself between Buddy and the man. "He's here," he replied, his voice firm but low. Rhodes crossed his arms and stepped forward, ignoring the warning in Ethan's eyes. He looked at Buddy, who curled up in the corner, eyes wide. "Enough with the nonsense. Either you deal with this now or I will. And you know how I do it." "No," Ethan responded immediately, surprising even himself. He took a step forward, now fully between Rhodes and Buddy. "If you want to do something to him, you'll have to go through me." Ethan's breath was heavy, his heart pounding in his chest, but his stance was unwavering. Rhodes laughed, a dry, ironic sound, but there was something serious in his gaze. "Are you really willing to risk everything for that dog, Miller?" the sergeant asked, now quieter, almost as if testing the soldier. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He knew that what was at stake went far beyond a dog. It was about what he still believed was right, even in a place where everything seemed wrong. "Yes," he finally answered, his voice filled with conviction. "I won't abandon him. He's not just a dog. He's the only thing that still reminds me who I am." Rhodes stared at Ethan for a long moment, the silence between them heavy as lead. Finally, he shook his head, as if losing patience. "You made your choice, Miller. I hope you're ready for the consequences." And with that, the sergeant turned and left, leaving the tent shrouded in an unsettling silence. When Ethan turned his gaze back to Buddy, he found the dog trembling slightly, but still looking at him with that silent trust. Ethan knelt down and ran his hand over his head. "It's okay, partner," he whispered, but the words sounded empty even to him. Rhodes' threat still hung over them like a shadow, and Ethan knew this wasn't the end of the story. As the day went on, Ethan began to realize that keeping Buddy there was becoming unsustainable. He would need to find a way to get him off the base, or worse, accept that he might have to say goodbye in order to ensure his safety. The thought felt like a knife through his chest. As night fell, Ethan sat in silence with Buddy, the dog leaning against his leg, as if he knew that every moment together was precious. Ethan gazed up at the starry sky through the small opening in the tent's canvas. "I'll find a way out, Buddy," he murmured, "even if it costs me everything." The wind continued to blow outside, and Ethan felt that something was about to change. The promise he had made to Buddy now seemed like a heavier burden than he could carry, but he wouldn't give up, not as long as he still had strength. The darkness of the night enveloped the base like a heavy blanket, but the weight pressing on Ethan's chest was even greater. Sitting on the ground, he watched Buddy sleep, the small, still fragile body breathing softly. Ethan knew time was running out. Sergeant Rhodes' words were clear as a death sentence, and the only chance to save the dog was to run away with him. Still, the risk was almost unbearable. If he failed, Buddy would pay the price and he would lose everything. In the morning, during breakfast, Ethan ran into Jackson, who immediately noticed the restlessness in his friend's eyes. "Miller, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" Ethan hesitated, but eventually whispered the truth. "I'm getting the dog out of here. If I do nothing, Rhodes is going to kill him." Jackson fell silent, studying his friend as if searching for some logic in the madness he was about to commit. "You know what that means, right? If they catch you, it's over." Ethan simply nodded, his expression determined. He'd rather face any consequence than see Buddy suffer. That night, Jackson returned to the tent with an old backpack and a serious expression. "Here it is. Water, food, and the map with the least patrolled routes. If you're going to do this, do it fast," he murmured, handing over the package. Ethan took the backpack firmly, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Jackson huffed, shaking his head. "Because deep down, you're right. Sometimes, we have to save something small to remind us that we're still human." Ethan kneeled next to Buddy, feeling his heart pound in his chest. The dog looked at him, as if sensing what was about to happen. "We're getting out of here, partner. You're going to live," he whispered, his voice breaking. Ethan strapped his backpack on and carefully lifted Buddy into his arms, feeling the small body tremble gently against him. For a moment, the soldier closed his eyes and took a deep breath, knowing this was their only chance. Leaving the tent under the dark cover of night, Ethan moved through the darkest corners of the base, the cold wind blowing against his face. Each step felt like a challenge, every sound making him stop and hold his breath. His heart pounded like a war drum as he moved forward, Buddy still in his arms. The escape would be risky, maybe impossible, but Ethan couldn't give up. He knew Buddy's life depended on him, and somehow his own did too. The desert's darkness felt endless as Ethan moved forward, each step heavy with tension. Buddy remained motionless in the soldier's arms, his small body wrapped in a thin blanket, as if he knew that silence was a matter of survival. The wind blew cold, dragging grains of sand across the barren ground, and the distant sound of military patrols served as a deadly warning. Ethan paused for a moment, hiding behind an abandoned structure. His heart was pounding so loudly he feared it could be heard. He glanced at the horizon, searching for a safe path, and spotted a narrow trail covered in shrubs that seemed to lead away from the base. Moving forward felt like stepping on glass. Every movement seemed to echo in the silence, and Ethan's heavy breathing grew shorter with each step. In the distance, a lantern light swept across the terrain, stopping just a few feet from where he was. Ethan crouched down, covering Buddy with his own body, cold sweat dripping down his neck. "It's okay, Buddy. Just a little more," he whispered, though even he didn't completely believe it. When the light finally disappeared, he slowly stood up, his legs trembling, and continued the escape. Each time he looked at Buddy, he found renewed strength. He couldn't fail now. Hours later, the dawn began to paint the sky with shades of red and gold, bringing with it a new danger: the light. Ethan knew that darkness would no longer be his ally for much longer. His eyes scanned the horizon until they found an abandoned building, half buried in sand. He quickened his pace, carefully carrying Buddy, and entered the decrepit structure. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, but it offered shelter. Ethan set the dog down on the ground, and Buddy slowly opened his eyes, wagging his tail for the first time. "See? We made it, partner. We're almost there," Ethan whispered, feeling a spark of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. As the sun slowly rose, Ethan leaned against the wall, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. Outside, the war raged on, indifferent to the moment of peace he and Buddy shared. Ethan knew they'd soon be missed at base and the search would begin. He would be treated as a deserter, but he didn't regret it. Saving Buddy wasn't just about the dog. It was about proving to himself that there was still something good and pure in the world. He looked at the small animal, sleeping peacefully beside him, and took a deep breath. The battle wasn't over, but for now they were safe. Dawn was breaking, and the intense sunlight was creeping through the cracks in the makeshift shelter. Ethan gazed at the horizon through the broken window, his mind swirling in a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew he didn't have much time before the base soldiers realized he was missing. Every minute spent here was a dangerous gamble. Buddy, still wrapped in the blanket, slept peacefully, unaware of the chaos unfolding around them. Ethan knelt beside him, gently running his hand over the little dog's head. "We'll get through this, Buddy. I promise," he murmured, though the promise weighed heavily in his voice. Outside, the sound of engines began to echo through the desert. Ethan froze, his heart racing in his chest. He quickly hid next to the window, peering out cautiously. A military vehicle was crossing the horizon, its tires leaving deep tracks in the sand. They were looking for him. Ethan took a deep breath, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. His mind worked quickly. He needed to get out of there before it was too late. Lifting Buddy in his arms once more, he prepared to leave the shelter. Every movement was calculated, as if any sound could give away his position. As he moved away from the building, Ethan took a more concealed route, using dunes and dry bushes for cover. The sun blazed against his skin, and the weight of Buddy began to take its toll. But he didn't stop. Every step was driven by something greater than himself. Saving that small life meant preserving the only thing that still made him human. In the distance, the sound of the engines grew louder again, this time closer. Ethan crouched down, hiding behind a tall dune. He held his breath, his eyes locked on the horizon. A vehicle passed just a few feet from where he was, but it didn't stop. The soldier exhaled slowly, feeling his heart pound so hard it seemed to echo in the silence of the desert. When night finally fell, Ethan and Buddy were exhausted. They found shelter in a small cave between two rocks. Ethan carefully placed Buddy on the ground and collapsed next to him, feeling his body as heavy as lead. The dog, though weak, nestled against the soldier's chest, as if he knew he was safe there. Ethan looked up at the starry sky, his mind flooded with memories. The war had taken so much from him, but Buddy was a reminder that there was still something worth fighting for. "We'll keep going, partner. No matter what happens," Ethan whispered, his gaze steady, determined. The desert was unforgiving, but he wouldn't give up. Not yet. The night dragged on slowly, with the biting cold of the desert taking over the small cave where Ethan and Buddy had found shelter. The silence was absolute, but the soldier's thoughts roared like a storm. Ethan felt the little dog lean against him, Buddy's fragile warmth bringing a sense of comfort that seemed impossible amidst the chaos. "We're still alive," he thought, pressing his lips into a firm line. But Ethan knew the calm wouldn't last long. Somewhere, Rhodes' men were tracking their movements. Time once again was against them. When the first light appeared on the horizon, Ethan stood up, his body stiff with exhaustion, but his mind as firm as a rock. He looked at Buddy, who wagged his tail gently, as if he understood it was time to move on. Ethan picked the dog up in his arms and left the cave, facing the sharp cold of the dawn. Every step was a battle against fatigue and doubt, but he didn't stop. The desert seemed endless, a sea of sand and solitude. Ethan didn't know exactly where he was going, but there was a promise guiding him. He would save Buddy, no matter the cost. It was then that the sound he feared the most broke the silence on the horizon. Engines, several of them, echoing across the desert like a final warning. Ethan turned quickly, his heart racing. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, accompanied by the silhouettes of military vehicles advancing toward them. They found us, he thought, feeling his body freeze. There was no time to run or hide. Looking at Buddy, he whispered firmly, "I won't let them take you. Do you hear me? It's not ending like this." His eyes burned, but he didn't let the tears fall. There was something stronger than fear driving him now. Ethan placed Buddy on the ground, kneeling in front of him. "Go, boy. Run. You can do it. I'll distract them." But the little dog didn't move. He just looked at Ethan with those eyes full of trust, as if he knew he would never abandon him. Ethan's throat tightened. The sound of the engines grew louder, closer. Finally, he picked Buddy up in his arms again and ran. The desert stretched out like an eternity ahead, but he wouldn't give up. The vehicles were almost on top of them, and gunshots began to echo, kicking up sand around them. Ethan held Buddy tight against his chest, his breath ragged, the only thing on his mind being the desperate wish to get him away from that place.